Now let's see how we can activate our grain simulation. And in here right now, here as you can see, we are importing our source from SOP. And let me go into my pop grain node and let's lower down increase its value to 0.05 to create a much low resolution, and that will create a faster playback. And let's hit play. And here as you can see, right now we are just importing these sand source or these grain particles into our this top net, and we are simulating them. And in here let's see how we can activate these grains particles to create a crumbling sand effect. So in here let's see how we can do that. And in here, if I were to go back, here you can see I always get this weird visualization, and that is actually coming from this attribute noise. And here you can see this visualizer has been turned on. Let's click on it and that will just turn off the visualization. And here you will see that we have the correct visualization that we had set into this pop color node. So in here I'm going to create another source in here. So first maybe I'm going to just duplicate all of these nodes. Just click and drag in here to duplicate all of the node graph. And in here right now we are using the sphere as a source. Maybe let's create a squab geometry in here. That is an interesting geometry. Let me view this. And in here I'm going to just adjust its rotation, and let's rotate this like so. I want to move these points a bit up. And onto the translation, let's also lift this squab up so that it's not going through the ground. And I think that is fine. And in here I'm going to just remove the mountain node, and let's also remove the attribute noise. We do not need this. Let's only just keep this grain source, and also let's keep the transform. We will need this transform. And in here let me rearrange this. In here let's first create a activation attribute that will cause these grain particles to activate. And in here first maybe let's connect this into the grain source, because that will be our sourcing particles. And in here let's create the activation attribute. And the way that I can do that, I can create a attribute transfer node. And in here to explain this, let's create a color node. And in here, as you know that we can set a color. I'm going to create a black color. Let me view this, and I'm going to just duplicate this node in here, and I'm going to change this to a value of green or red color. And onto this sphere I'm using the polygons to create this high resolution mesh. And for transferring the attribute, we do not need that many points. And to create a lightweight geometry, let's change this to primitive, and that will just create a 1 point with the radius. And now let's create a attribute transfer node to transfer the attributes. Let's add attribute transfer, and that is the geometry that I want to transfer to, and I want to transfer from this sphere. And in here let's view this, and here you can see all of our color value has been transferred. But what I can do, I can go into the attribute transfer, and right now we are transferring all of the primitive and points attribute, but we only want to transfer the points. So let's uncheck this primitive. And let's go into the condition tab, and in here I can play around with this distance value. Let's lower this value down, and here you can see that we are creating this growing attribute, and here we have the growth. So we can just animate this parameter, and that will cause all of these propagation effect, and that will cause these particles to crumble. So in here I can just go into the transform node when the node is selected, hover over to the viewport, and I can just use this handle, and in here I can define where I want these sand particles to start collapsing. I can start them from here, and onto the attribute transfer I just need to animate this parameter, And in here, maybe let's add a keyframe. So at the very first frame, let's change this to 0. Press and hold the Alt key. Let's add a key. And let's go few frame, maybe frame number, let's say 48. That will be the 2 seconds. And after 2 seconds, let's continue adjusting this until I see all of these red values. And I think I have changed all of these particles to red. So in here, let's press and hold the Alt key and click on this parameter to add another key. And now if I were to hit play, and here you will see we have the growth animation effect. So right now we are transferring this color, which is fine. We can use this CD to activate, but what I can do, I can create a special active attribute. So in here, we can create a attribute create node in here, and I'm going to just create this onto this side. I'm going to remove the color from both of them. I don't want to transfer the color. And in here, we can say that I want to create a active attribute. So in here, I'm going to say active, and its default value should be 0. And let's drag this, duplicate this attribute create node and connect this onto this side. And in here, I'm going to give a value of 1, which means that we are transferring this active 1 value to our this 0. So let's go into the attribute transfer. Onto the attributes, right now we are transferring all of the attribute, which is fine, which means that we will get our this active attribute transferred over time. And let's go into our this popnet, and in here, let's drive inside the popnet. And if I were to hit play, and here you will see we have the same effect. And maybe let's go into the pop grain node, and I'm going to just zero out the clumping to create a dry sand effect. And let's hit play, and here you can see we have our this same effect. And that is because the active attribute that we have just created, this active attribute, it has no meaning into our this simulation. So the pop solver does not know what to do with the active attribute. We do have active attribute. If I were to middle mouse button, let me move this aside, and here you can see we do have active attribute, but it's just there. It's not doing anything because all of the pop grain node and the pop solver, all of these solver, they do not know what the active attribute is. But there is an attribute that this solver can understand, and that is the mass, which means we can set the mass. And if I were to go back, and let's go into the attribute create node, and in here, let's change this to mass. So mass is the attribute that this solver use to set the mass of these particles. So if the particles has no mass, if the mass is 0, which means the gravity will not affect. The gravity will have no effect if the particles do not have mass. So which means that all of the particles will not be active because they do not have mass. What I can do, I can create a mass. I'm initializing this to 0. And in here, we need to do the same thing. We need to create a mass attribute, and we are setting this to 1. And in here, now if I dive inside and hit play, and now here you can see our particles are not moving. This gravity has no effect because we do not have a mass. And in here, this animated mass attribute that we just use the distance threshold to animate, this animated attribute will not going to be imported inside of our dynamic, because onto the pop source, as you know, we are only importing our source at the very first frame, and after that the simulation is just taking care of all of these particles and simulating them, which means that after the second frame, when we have the animation, we have the updated the mass, all of these updated will not going to be imported inside of the DOP.NET. And to actually import them over time, update this mass attribute at each frame inside of the DOP. In here, we can create a WAP network. So inside of the DOP, we do have a pop warp. Let's add this. Here we have the pop warp, and let's add this. And pop warp is an a same attribute warp node, and it is designed to work with particle simulation, and it will going to be calculated every frame because it is now is an a part of the simulation. If the simulation is going to be calculated every frame, our this pop warp is also going to be calculated every frame. So now let's dive inside, and in here let's import our this mass attribute, inside of our this pop warp. And to actually import this attribute, we have a node called import point attribute. Because we are creating the point attribute, we need to add the import point attribute. We also have the detail, primitive, all of these options, but because we are working with points, let's add an import point attribute. And in here we need to define the ptnum. We need to set the point number as well, and you know that because we are working with same source, and in here we have these number of particles, so all of these point number are the same inside of topnet as well, which means I can dive inside, and in here I can use the ptnum of our simulation point because simulation point and the source point are the same, so we can use this ptnum. And onto the file, we need to define the file. I can just use the op input 1, which means I'm referring to this first input. We have this first input. So in here I'm saying that import the attribute from the first input, and let's bring up the parameter of the import point. And in here right now we are importing the p, which means the position, but I want to import the mass attribute. So in here I can say mass, and that is a float attribute. So onto the signature we need to change this to float, and now our mass attribute has been imported. And now we just need to export this as a mass as well, because we are importing but we are not setting this. And to set this, we need to create a bind export node, and that will export out the attribute. And in here same thing, I want to set my mass, so let's change this to mass, and let's connect the result into here. And now we should see the crumbling effect. Let's hit play, and here you can see our particles are still not moving. And there is a one thing that we need to do, and that is let's go into the pop warp parameter of this node itself, and in here we have the option to the inputs. Let's go in here, and here we have the inputs, these 4 inputs. So these inputs are referring to these inputs. So in here I'm going to say that the input first. So if we were to dive inside, actually these inputs that we have, these inputs were actually referring to these inputs that we have in here, these op input 1 2 3 4. So we are referring to these. So we are saying that this op input 1, this one, it will be referred to, we can say SOP. We can define in here our own SOP node, or I can just say first context geometry, which means that please import our this first context geometry. So which means that our this input 1, this will refer to the first context, and we are importing this first context, this mass, and we are setting this. And now we should see the crumbling effect. Let's hit play again, and there you go. Here you can see our particles are now activated over time because we are importing our mass attribute. And in here let's go into the pop grain node, and maybe let's lower down the particle separation. Let's lower this down to 0.03 so that we have much more detail. And let's hit play again, and here you can see we have our these grain activation, and right now our particles are not sliding too much because we are removing most of their kinetic energy. So I'm going to just default out the scale kinetic to their default value, and let's hit play again. And now we should see that our particles will retain their most of their energy, and we should see some of the sliding, and there you go. And here we have it. So that's how you can activate your grain over time. You can import your attributes inside of the topnet using the pop warp node. and that way we can achieve an a activating this crumbling sand effect.